All right, welcome back to Genesis. We have oodles to get to once again, so let's dive right in. Last week we looked at the character of Isaac along with some additional characters, so we focused on Isaac. And we talked about how as God is continuing to work out his plan, he is now working through specifically Isaac through the selection of Sarah. And we talked about how, hey, Abraham had other sons, right? Abraham wasn't the problem, but God specifically opted to work through Sarah and through the line of Isaac. And as we looked at what Isaac had going on in his life, we noted that he had a really generous attitude toward his neighbors. And we saw how whenever his neighbors were saying, hey, you know what, we're going to fill in those wells, we're going to pursue you, be really obnoxious, he just kept moving over and saying, you know what, I'm just going to extend a gracious, generous attitude toward you. And yet, he seemed to have a scarcity mindset in his heart towards his family. Whenever he was thinking about doling out those blessings, he was like, I got one. I've got one blessing for my one favorite kid, and that's it. And at the same time, we saw within him kind of that same deceitful, self-protective streak that we first saw in Abraham with the whole, you know what, whenever I'm in a sticky situation, the push might become a pinch. Can you just say that you're my sister, and then, yeah, you end up might getting, somebody might sleep with you, but that'll protect me, right? And so we saw that at the same time that we saw a faith that was, again, willing to take steps, that chutzpah, that attitude of, you know what, God is calling me to do something. And even through all of the things going on in my life and my family history, I'm willing to step out. And as we see the biblical narrative start to shift toward Jacob, we're going to see a lot of these things continue. Where are we? We are taking a look at Jacob primarily this week, pages 143 to 173. And so as we saw at the end of last week, as we wrapped up the first part of chapter 28, we saw how Jacob is, not exactly a pretty character, right? He has all this tricksterness going on. No matter which way you interpret the passage, Jacob isn't a pretty character. And as we think about how God is operating, there's a possibility, I think, for us to read it and to say, oh, well, God must have approved of what Jacob was doing because he got away with it, right? And so everything that happens in Scripture, we just know that God's just saying, oh, yep, that's great, nodding along. No, not necessarily, right? And that's the tricky thing with interpreting narrative is things will happen in the text. And just because something happens doesn't necessarily mean that God either directly caused it or was like, 2 thumbs up, great job, Jacob. Now, in the stories, we're not going to see God explicitly coming down and either rebuking or offering a 2 thumbs up, but we are going to see Jacob's life having some consequences for his actions, some things playing out on him. So, as we dive back into chapter 28, and moving into chapter 29, we're going to see that God does appear to Jacob, but again, he doesn't say either good job or what was that, you little rascal? That was not exactly a nice thing. Instead, he just shows up and says, hey, Jacob, this is who I am, and I'm with you. And he has this interesting dream where he has Jacob's ladder, where he sees angels going up and coming down. That's probably a visual representation of what God is trying to communicate to him, which is that I'm present. I'm here. There's this interaction between heaven and earth that's going on. And I do find that comforting because how often in our own lives do we do something that you're like, God's got to be up in heaven just sort of saying, oh my goodness, not again. And yet, does he give up on us? Does he just say, okay, throw it in the towel? No, he says, I am with you and I will continue to be with you. His action in our lives is not solely based on our faithfulness, but it is instead based in his character. So he promises Jacob, I am with you and I will keep you wherever you go. And then Jacob wakes up and he makes a sort of half-hearted vow, right? Verse 20, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And you're like, dude, like Abraham and Isaac seem to be like wholeheartedly, they're ready to rock and roll, and Jacob's like, yo, what's in it for me? What's in it for me, man? Okay, so if you can prove you're under the bargain, then okay, then sure, then I'll make you my God. And what I find really interesting is that God seems to be like, okay, Jacob, you know what? What you'll give me, I'm going to work with it. I'm going to work with it. Which is, again, like, I feel, in my heart, I'm a little bit judgmental toward Jacob. I'm like, you are not, like, a great character, man. But God seems to be willing to say, okay, you know what? You want in at least a little bit. And I'm going to work with this attitude that wants in. And as we move into chapter 29 now, we have Jacob finally coming to the land of the people of the east. And we have this well. Now remember, we've looked at wells previously. Remember, in our culture, we think well and we think, you know, a little circular thing. But back in these days, wells are more like giant room-sized cisterns. And we have all these shepherds who are sort of with Laban and the big people today, Hor, and they're like, hey, yeah, we're waiting for more people to come to move away the rock that's guarding the cistern. And some people are like, oh well, maybe these guys were just lazy and they were like, oh, that's too much work. We need to wait for more people to arrive. It's also possible, if you think about who would have been doing shepherding, it would have most likely been younger kids and or young women who were shepherds. Now in this case, it does seem to be definitely young men who are doing this. And so, I mean, teenagers, now some teenage boys, you think, oh, well, they're pretty strong. But, I mean, if they're young enough, they may not have been that strong. And so maybe they really do need like 20 of them together so that they can roll with soon away. Regardless, Jacob's like, excuse me, I'm Arnold Schwarzenegger here because we have Rachel rolling in. And, Jacob's like, oh. Hello there. And he rolls the stone away, and he runs up, and he kisses her, and then weeps aloud. And whenever I have previously read through this, I always got this impression that he was just like, oh my gosh, I'm so overwhelmed, because this is Rachel, and this is the one I'm going to marry, and I'm just like, oh. And it's just this beautiful, like, happy tears. However, this phrase, weep aloud, in Hebrew is not really used in a positive sense throughout Scripture. In fact, the last time we saw it used was whenever Esau irrevocably lost his firstborn birthright. Whenever he realized that it had been taken by Jacob, he lifted up his voice and wept aloud. It's that same thing. So, some commentators theorize that what's going on here is that Jacob is weeping because God has revealed to him that Rachel was going to die early and then be buried in a separate place from the rest of the family, which to us, you're like, buried in a different plot, so what? But for them, that would have been significant, and so that is one theory. Another really interesting theory is that he weeps because he doesn't have anything to offer. And you're like, well, what do you mean he doesn't have anything to offer? Well, as we move into the next slide, we have, as we continue chapter 29, we have this whole interaction with him and Laban, and Laban comes running out of the house because if you remember the last time that we had a man from Abraham's house coming to get a wife, it was Eliezer, and he had what? He had 10 camels full of stuff. He had all these gifts, and they threw all kinds of gifts and things at not just Rebecca, but at the whole family. And so Laban seems to perhaps be anticipating, well, some more gifts. And there's no sign that Jacob gives them anything. Instead, the Hebrew of verse 14, where Laban responds to him, is like, oh, brother, your family, sort of like a disappointed, oh, it's you, okay. And it's interesting because he ends up, we know, Jacob works not just a year for Rachel, but 7 years twice over to earn Rachel. Now, did Eliezer end up working for Rebecca? No. Did Eliezer end up working for Rebecca? No, he just shows up with a whole bunch of gifts, and they're like, okay, well, do you want to go? And she's like, yeah, sounds good. And then he sends her off. There is none of that here. And so it does seem like Jacob shows up empty-handed, and so we ask why. The Midrash has a really interesting story that, again, how do they come up with these stories? I have no idea. But they're like, hey, so Esau actually sent his son, one of his sons, after Jacob to try to kill him. But then whenever the son showed up, he was like, you know what? No, we're from the same family. I can't do this. But what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to show up before dad and just let him, what am I supposed to tell him? And Jacob said, well, you know what, I have all this stuff, go ahead and just take all of this gold, because then I'll be poor, and being poor is just about as good as being dead. Which you're like, I mean, that's an interesting, sure, that implies, I don't know. But it is also possible that Isaac, whenever he's like, okay, fine, I'll bless you, that's all you got. I'm not giving you one whit of anything else, go to your brother, but you're not getting anything to go with you. And I think that is very plausible. But the story does seem to lend itself to saying that Jacob did show up empty-handed. Is that why he wept? I don't know. Food for thought. We do a note here. So in verse 17, we have this note that Rachel is beautiful in form and appearance. We're like, man, Taraz's line is just like these gorgeous women. So let's like keep that compliment in your back pocket next time one of your lady friends is really, really rocking. You're like, Tara's daughter, you just look like one of his offspring, and they're gonna be like, what are you even talking about? You're like, no, it's a compliment. It's a compliment, my friend. Regardless, verse 18 does say Jacob loved Rachel, and he's like, you know what? I will go ahead and serve you. And it's one of those beautiful romances. You're like, oh. It was like just a few days to him because he was so in love with Rachel. And you're like, oh, that's so pretty. But then Jacob meets his deceptive match in Laban, because Laban's like, I'm getting a pretty good deal out of this. He's a pretty hard worker. And other pieces of the text also reveal that the Lord was blessing Laban's household because of Jacob's presence. And so Laban pulls the switcheroo of the century, and wedding night arrives, or something like it. And instead of giving Rachel to Jacob, he gives Leah, who appears to be the firstborn. And Jacob wakes up and he's like, what's wrong? What have you done? Which, for us, you're sort of like, how in the world could this have possibly happened? But there are a few things that could be at work here. First of all, I mean, it is going to probably be at night, so it is dark, and you're like, I'm not persuaded. She probably would have been veiled, which, again, you're like, I'm still not sold. He was probably also fairly inebriated, which perhaps is the thing that pushes you over the edge, and you're like, oh, everything makes sense now. One of those drinking parties that, I don't know why ESV does this, but every time it says made a feast, it's more like a drinking party. So we saw this as well with Lot. Whenever the Lot brought the angels in, he didn't have a feast, he had a drinking party. So they had a drinking party, and so that's why he did that. So regardless, Jacob's like deeply offended, and Laban says, oh, well, this isn't, surely you know that this isn't something that we do to give the younger daughters away before the firstborn. And inherent in that, I think the Lord is even here using using Laban's trickery to sort of show Jacob, hey, deception with the firstborn, the firstborn of Laban's goes in under the guise of the younger, and Jacob went in under the guise of the elder, and so we have the Lord already starting to serve justice back. It's all good. You know what? This is a perfect opportunity for me to take a sip of water. That's right. Bring it in. Bring it in. So we see Jacob already starting to receive some justice here. And then we have this great soap opera, right? And we have the battle of the wives. And we start off, Leah is not loved. Rachel is, which is heartbreaking for Leah, right? Leah is just this poor woman who is wedded to a man who doesn't like her. And so he opens her womb. Rachel is barren. And Leah is just popping them out. And it's funny because whenever we read through all of these verses in chapter 29 and 30, to us, I mean, we can read through these verses in like 12 seconds, right? But in reality, this would have been taking place over years. And if you think about the whole weaning process and adding that in, it's not just like a few years. This is potentially taking place over decades. Lots of time for all of this envy and hurt to be building up. And so we do have Leah naming her sons, and the names are corresponding with her desires. So the Lord has looked upon my affliction. Now my husband will love me. And so we have her both crediting the Lord and sort of demonstrating her trust in the Lord, but at the same time, she's expressing her desire. And remember, names were powerful, and so in naming her children these things, she is like it's not like wishful, but it's like almost like the willing something into effect. And so that's what she is hoping for with all of these sons. So she gets to 4. At her last one, she says, this time I will praise the Lord. There is no mention of a desire for her husband. She calls his name Judah. Judah will be a significant character in the future. She stops having children. And then Rachel's like, buddy, give me kids. Which, as Jacob does rightly say, hey, am I God? Is he God? No, but has he intervened on her behalf to the Lord? There's no note of it. Again, in contrast to Isaac and similarly to Abraham, Jacob just sort of leans back and is like, you take God off. I don't know what to tell you. This whole situation's not pretty. Both Rachel and Bilhah, not Bilhah, Rachel and Leah end up giving their servants, Bilhah and Zilpah, to Jacob to sort of act as surrogates. The surrogacy situation works out a little bit better than the last time whenever Sarah offered up Hagar. And so each of those servants ends up bearing 2 children. And so now we have 8 sons of Jacob. And then we have the Mandrake interlude, which is again, it's a soap opera. So I don't know about you guys, but whenever I read Mandrake, it is impossible for me not to think of Harry Potter and the Mandrake plant and the screaming children that pulled out of the place like, ah! And you're like, that's what I picture whenever I think Mandrake. This is probably not what they were thinking when they wrote Mandrake. The word in Hebrew is actually just boiling, and which so they think it's some sort of aphrodisiac that so whenever you consumed it, it would make you hot. You get a little bit hot and bothered, and so you'd be a little bit more ready to do some stuff, and perhaps potentially a little bit more fertile. And so whenever this was being translated in the medieval times, mandrakes were thought to be similarly an aphrodisiac. And so that's why this word is there. So now you know. Put that in your back pocket, whip it out at the next biblical knowledge conference that you go to, right? So whatever the case is with the magic plant, which may or may not actually do anything, Leah's son, Reuben, finds some, and then Rachel apparently is no longer allowing Leah access to Jacob, which you're like, there are so many things so badly wrong with this entire situation. But they end up bartering, so Leah says, fine, I'll give you these aphrodisiacs so that potentially, you may have some success in the childbearing department so that I can sleep with my husband. And Rachel's like, deal. And she, and then Leah's like, Jacob, you have to sleep with me tonight. And he's like, fine. And you're like, oh my gosh, it's a nightmare. Regardless, the Lord listens once again to Leah. She has a 5th son, and then apparently Jacob was like, I guess that's worth it. And because he sleeps with her a couple more times, she has a couple more kids, ending with a daughter named Dinah, or Dinah. And it's interesting because both Leah and then Rachel, through her maidservant, named their children essentially Justice. So Dan and Dinah both are names that have to do with justice. And the type of justice that Dean is a subjugative justice, so putting people back in their place. And that's what this entire thing is they're struggling for ascendancy over each other to say, I'm the best one. I'm the best wife. And they're coveting. It's so terrible because each one wants what the other one has. Leah wants to be loved, and she just keeps having children, but she can't find, it doesn't seem to have lasting joy or blessing in the children that she has. Rachel, she has the love for her husband all the way until the end. But even here at the end, whenever the Lord finally remembers, and it's not like he forgot about her, but it's that remembrance, okay, remembering into action. He is now acting for Rachel and opens her womb, and she conceives, and she says, okay, yes, the Lord has taken away my reproach, and she named him Joseph, which means, may he add. And you're like, girl, can you, like, you finally get the desire of your heart and you just want more. And how true is that of us, that so often we're not content with the Lord, what the Lord has given us, and we're just wanting more. Leah and Rachel, again, it's heartbreaking. Both of their, obviously, all of their sons will become the 12 tribes of Israel. Each one will end up being significant, but perhaps not in the way that we would anticipate if we're sort of tracking patterns here. If we remember, Abraham had multiple women in his life. The one that was barren, Sarah, ended up being the chosen wife through whom the mission would be carried. Isaac, bless his heart, had one blessed wife who was barren, and so the Lord ended up opening her womb, and it was through her that the mission continued. Jacob has 4 women in his life, and one of them is distinctly named as being barren, and it's Rachel. But, in contrast, she is not the one through whom the promise will continue. Instead, it will be through Leah, through her son Judah, that the mission will continue and be realized first in one of the greatest kings in Israel's history, King David, and ultimately, of course, in the line of Jesus. Now, Rachel's son Joseph does some pretty cool stuff too, and we're going to have some really neat stuff with Benjamin as well. And again, neat stories coming out, so we're not going to completely forget about Rachel. But I think especially for Leah, because she so desired to be loved and chosen. In her lifetime, was she by her husband? No. But the Lord was working behind the scenes, and he was working not just in her generation, but through the generations. And I find that encouraging, because how often in our lives do we struggle to find meaning in things, to find, okay, I don't feel like I'm accomplishing anything. I don't feel like what I'm doing is mattering. But we have a God who isn't just at work in our lifetime, but through all lifetimes. And so we can trust him to establish the work of our hands. As we continue, we have a lot of chapters to get through, so let's keep rolling here. So, as the wives are having the baby push challenge, Jacob is working. He's doing a different kind of work. He's working in the fields for Laban, and over the period of 20 years, apparently he's just been working and not taking any wages, because the first 14 he was working to get his wives, and what he was doing with the rest, I don't know what's going on with those intervening 6 years, but he eventually gets to the place where he and Laban have this exchange, and they're like, hey, I want to go home. And Laban's like, cool, what can I give you? And he's like, no, I want to make sure I earn it, so that you can't, don't just say you gave it to me, I don't want to owe you anything. And so they end up agreeing that Jacob is going to take the speckled, spotted, black, discolored animals, lambs, goats, and etc. There's a neat little play on words, because Laban sounds like Lavan, which means white, and so the white guy gets all the white chiefs. So that's that. But this is, I don't know how I never caught this in all of my years of studying the scripture. But so over here in verse 35, so they have this whole agreement here, and Laban in verse 34 says, good, let it be to me as you have said. But that day, Laban removed the male goats that were striped and spotted, all the female goats, and he put them in charge of his son. So they have this whole arrangement that Jacob is going to get all the spotted sheep, and then Laban's like, just kidding, I'm going to take away your starter flock. And I was like, oh my gosh! Truly, Jacob has met his match in deceptiveness. Now, obviously the Lord is at work, because we have this whole, the magic sticks section over here. Now, there is some scholarly debate about what exactly is going on in this section. Probably what's at work is some combination of the Lord guiding Jacob to the sheep that have the recessive genes for the spottedness, and so they're breeding together and having then the spotted sheep and goats and whatnot. Also, so if you're familiar at all with Native American culture and how they would take all of these different berries and sticks and stuff and make all of these teas that were very medicinal in nature. And the trees that were in the region where Jacob would have been also had a lot of medicinal benefits. So if you're putting them in water, that's how you get the medicinal benefit, and that's what he was doing. And so the sheep that he was breeding ended up being stronger, potentially more fertile, and so probably some combination thereof. Of course, the Lord is the one who is ultimately granting Jacob success, and he ends up having lots of stuff. Chapter 31, Jacob hears that the sons of Laban are unhappy, and then the Lord shows up and he says, hey, go head back home. And so Jacob goes to Laban and says, hey, the Lord has let me know that I need to go home, so I'm going to take my stuff and I'm going to head out. Thank you so much. Alas, no, that is not what happened, because Jacob just can't get away from his deceptive little streak, and he's like, okay, so girls, here's what we're going to do. And he has a little chat with his wives, and he's like, look, Laban hasn't treated me well. And they're like, he hasn't treated us well, right? Then yeah, let's go. And so whenever Laban goes out to shear the sheep, so we think, okay, like he's just in the backyard shearing the sheep, right? But no, this would have been like a time-intensive process. You would have to go out into the field, and it's not like today where they have like this, okay, that sheep's done, like this would have been a very time-intensive process. So he's out in the field, and Jacob's like, this is a perfect opportunity for us to run like we stole it. And he does, in fact, run like they stole it. And a few days later, Laban hears, and he's like, over my dead body. And so he hitches up and is on the pursuit. And because Jacob has all of his flocks and all of his kids, he's not going too fast, apparently. And apparently Laban is really, really intent on pursuing him because, well, Laban catches up, and then it's really funny because Laban is so offended. He's like, I can't believe that you went away without allowing me to say goodbye to my grandsons and my daughters. Also, you stole my house of the gods. Which is clearly the thing that he cares the most about, because then he has this whole thing. The Hebrew text is literally like he groped through all of their stuff and was looking for these household gods, these little things. What were they exactly? I don't know. Some sort of, they thought, whatever. And so Jacob has this really interesting response. He says, anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live. That's going to come back to play later, so just pin that. Because Jacob didn't know that Rachel had stolen them, but who stole the gods? It was Rachel. And again, the Hebrew is kind of funny because it's Laban went first into Jacob's tent, and then into Leah's, and then into the servants' tents. And you can almost picture like Rachel originally has them in her tent, and then she's like, oh fiddlesticks, and it's like one of those comedy sketches where she's like has it and just like hiding them behind her back, and then she's like, and then like puts them on, and then like gets up. Sorry, Dad, I can't come down on my period. Yeah, I mean, it's real gross. Yeah, you never like those. So, so she says, I'm really sorry, I can't come down. And we have then the further interactions where Jacob is mad. Again, the Hebrew is like his nose was hot, which you're just like, like one of those Looney Tune commercials. But the 20-year rant that has been building up over this time finally explodes. And he's like, look, I don't have your darn gods, and so let's just agree to disagree. And Laban's like, well, I'm pretty sure you get your gods, but I can't find them. So fine. So they have this peace thing and this little covenant, and it's very clearly, the tension is very, very thick in this passage. It is not like the best parting of the ways here. But the Lord is still, again, he's with Jacob. He is very definitively preserving Jacob and his family's lives. So they end up saying, okay, we have this agreement. It is funny because they can't name it the same thing. They call it two different things because, they're swearing by different gods. And so, the differences are all over this passage. But regardless, Laban finally goes off, and we have, for just a breath of time, a peaceful end, because then in the very next section, Jacob is like, okay, you know what? It's time to see Esau. And you're like, why in the world would you tell Esau that you're here? Well, if you think about it though, so you've been gone for over 20 years and you finally stroll on back in. If you don't send word, what is Esau going to think? He's going to think, oh, you're coming back to make trouble. So he's like, I think I would like to try to avoid trouble with this brother who I very radically deceived and stole from 20 years ago. Let's not do that. I feel like I'm in a little bit of a vulnerable position. So he sends word, and then the messengers in verse 6 return to Jacob saying, we came to your brother Esau. He's coming to meet you with 400 men. And you're like, oh, well, that's bad. So Jacob has a little bit of a panic attack here, greatly afraid and distressed, and he has multiple escape plans that he puts into place. He's like, okay, I'm gonna do 2 groups, and then he sleeps on it for a little bit. He's like, no, 4 groups. I'm gonna least love wives and they're fun, and then my next love wife, and then my most precious ones, and then I'm gonna send them gifts. Yes, gifts, 500 plus animals. We're just gonna You know what? Break the animals into groups too, because then it's going to look like there's more. Which is just, I don't know. I think it's kind of funny. But he also does pray. So how much like Jacob are we? Where something happens and we have our little panic attack and we spiral and we do all those things and then we're like, stop. Perhaps. Have I prayed? Have I prayed? Maybe I should consult the good Lord here. And when he prays, he prays for mercy. He prays for rescue. And I think Jacob is at the end of his rope here. He's recognizing whatever's coming to me, I deserve. And so he definitely is throwing himself upon the Lord's mercy. And then he sort of sends everybody away and ends up alone on the ford. And you're like, what in the world is going on? I don't know. Maybe it was a former prayer time. The text doesn't say. But we have this weird situation. Again, we're so comfortable with the text. We have this guy who shows up and they have a wrestling match that lasts all night and you're like, what is going on here? I don't know. It seems that he has, later he identifies the person with whom he is wrestling as the Lord, and we do have this really key thing where he's renamed, and who is the one who's been doing all of the renaming in the passages so far? God. The answer is God. Yeah, God. God's been the one who has been renaming people, and so it seems that whether it's a pre-incarnate iteration of Christ or an angel of the Lord, we're not really sure what's going on, but that's what seems to be happening. And I don't know if you've ever tried wrestling with God. But you don't win, right? But even so Jacob can't win, but he refuses to give up. He's like, no, I'm not gonna let nothing bless me. He's very obsessed with blessings, Jacob is. And I love verse 27 though. So he says to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. He finally is willing to admit, this is who I am. I'm the heel holder. I'm the trickster. I'm the deceiver. And he comes face to face with his identity. And I wish that this was so much more of a transformational moment for Jacob than it is, because in this moment of real honest admittance of who he is, the Lord renames him. He says, okay, nope, no longer will you be known for wrestling with your brother in the womb. I'm going to give you a new name, he who contends with the Lord. And then the text goes right back to calling him Jacob. Which, remember, with Abraham and Sarah, when they got their new names, text right away, he's like, oh, Abraham and Sarah. And I think, because you're going to see in the text that it switches. It switches between calling him Jacob and calling him Israel. Now, I can't say this with 100% certainty, because there are some areas where I'm like, oh, well, I'm not completely sure that lines up. But it seems that whenever Jacob is leaning into his new identity, that he's called Israel. But whenever he's sort of reverting to his Jacobness, that he's called Jacob. Now, again, I can't say that, but it sort of seems. So we're going to see later in Joseph's story as well. So pin that, put that in your back pocket. Don't eat the sinew of the thigh that's in the hip socket, because that's where, the end of the hip went out or something like that. So, Chapter 33, we have the actual resolution of the Jacob and Esau narrative. And I'm going to admit, Esau for me has always been one of those characters that I'm like, oh yeah, Esau's in the Bible too, you know, I'm like, oh, but Jacob's the important person because it's through him, the line of Christ, and all of that jazz is. But I love this whole tale with Esau because Esau got a little bit of a raw deal, right? I mean, he wasn't exactly jazzed about his birthright or about his, you know, but his blessing, like, he actually really cared about that. And Jacob just stole it right from under his nose. Again, sort of twice. He took the thing that he should have had twice. And here, Esau displays amazing forgiveness. He ran to meet him, embraced him, fell on his neck, and kissed him. And they wept. And if you, this language, I don't know, if you went through the workbook, it may have reminded you of Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32, which is the story of the prodigal son. And the prodigal son kind of lines up with this account. Prodigal son kind of matches what Jacob did. He got his inheritance early, he ran off, sort of screwed up his life a little bit, came back with the tail in between his legs asking for forgiveness. But interestingly, this is where the story sort of diverges a little bit. In the parable, who's the one who greets the son? It's the father. What does the older son do? He sits back, he folds his arms and says, how could you offer forgiveness? Now, if you're thinking about what Jesus is doing at that time, who were the older brothers in his story? Well, it was the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were not responding like the older brother should have. They should have behaved like Esau, offering forgiveness and redemption through offering access to the Lord through what they could have been doing in the temple and with all of the things that they were doing. And instead, they were putting up walls, keeping people away from a relationship with God, which I just love. I love that redemptive storyline for Esau. I think it's beautiful. Regardless, we have Esau here, so having this big back and forth. He finally accepts Jacob's gift, and Esau says, "You know what? Let's join. Okay, you know what? You're back, baby brother. I could hold this against you, but no, I'm actually going to invite us to join forces. You can come. You can journey with me." And Jacob's like, "Oh no. I mean, look at. We can't go as fast as you. Yeah." What? Clearly, Jacob is making excuses. Either he doesn't trust Esau, he doesn't trust the redemption that the Lord has worked. I don't know. Jacob is ready to do his own thing. It's funny because Jacob actually says, "Oh yeah. You just keep going. I'll catch up." And then he doesn't. He goes somewhere completely separate. And you're like, "Jacob, stop it! Like, just stop it." And what's kind of heartbreaking is where Jacob will set up shop, as we're going to see in the next chapter. We're going to see some really, really ugly things happen that potentially could have been avoided if he had just continued with his brother Esau. And in fact, let's go ahead and turn to chapter 34 here, because we have, again, as Jacob is making decisions, consequences are happening. Verse 1, Dinah, the daughter of Leah, goes out to see the women of the land, and Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, seizes her and rapes her. And it's one of the stories in Genesis that actually troubles me the most, because for Leah, who is not loved, we do see resolution in the pages of Scripture in her storyline. But for Dinah, there's really no resolution. We're just left with her heartbreak and her hurt. But let's take a closer look at what happens here. So after violating Dinah, Shechem talks to his dad and says, "Hey, I want her as my wife." Jacob hears about it, just sort of waits, and you're like, not like run in, grab her, and rescue her, just sort of like, "Oh, I'm going to wait for my sons to come in for the field." Bruh. So they come in, and then all of her brothers like, "Dude, are you kidding me?" So then Hamor and Shechem end up speaking with them, and I didn't realize this until, like, I don't know, maybe the 12th time I went through the passage. Verse 11, Shechem also said to her father and her brothers. So who is there? The whole gang. Jacob and the brothers are all there. "Let's just join forces. All right, y'all. So if you give us Dinah, and then we'll just sort of trade, and we can all become one big happy family." The sons of Jacob answer, not Jacob, the sons answer, and they say, "You know what? You guys aren't circumcised. Like, that's the problem here. It's just that you're not circumcised. Not the fact that you raped her and stole her, but the uncircumcision thing. Now, forget about the rape situation for just a moment. If they did want to join forces, and sort of become one big happy family, circumcision is the sign of the covenant, so would they have insisted on circumcision? Yes. Yeah, that would have been part of what's going on. We'll even see with the Jewish nation in Jesus' day, they're still doing circumcision whenever people are joining the Jewish faith, so that certainly would have been something that happens, but we know that they're answering him deceitfully. But what I just want to pause on here is that Jacob's like, yeah, sounds good. He's just nodding along like, oh yeah, that sounds like a great plan. Just get circumcised and then this will all be okay. So they end up all getting circumcised, and then, as we can surmise, that hurt. And so they're in pain, and then Simeon and Levi, who are two of Dinah's brothers, go out and they slaughter not only Shechem and Hamor, but the rest of the men of the city, and then they pillage the entire village, and they take everything. Some people try to read this redemptively and say, oh, well, after they killed all the males, well, somebody had to take care of the women. And you're like, let's not make excuses for terrible things, okay? We don't need to do that. We can say that they had a righteous zeal for their sister, and also they went way too far. Like, we can walk and we can chew gum at the same time. But it's really interesting because they say down here, should he treat our sister like a prostitute? And I always assumed that he meant Shechem, but it actually could also be referring to Jacob. That they were like, should our dad have just allowed her to be treated this way? We had to do something. And I feel like, again, this entire thing is just a giant condemnation of Jacob. All of his passivity, all of his sitting back. He's not willing to take action. He's not willing to do anything. And so, as we leave this heartbreaking story behind, we're going to see in chapter 35, I'm going to jump down toward the end to sort of link in what another son of Jacob does. Reuben has sex with his father's concubine Bilhah, and what's probably going on here is some sort of play for power, potentially even stemming from Jacob's inactivity and Reuben saying, hey, somebody has to lead this family. I'm going to step up and take the spot. And of course, do we condone that either? Nope. And this is also going to come back around and sort of bite Reuben as well. Now, while we have this entire familial breakdown going on, beginning of chapter 35, God does appear to Jacob, calls him to Bethel, and he says, hey, we're going to build an altar. And Jacob says to his household, yo, those pagan gods, put them away. And you're like, what are we doing? Like, how have we been carrying these pagan gods, these foreign gods this entire time? What are we doing? Jacob. So he finally does this whole thing. They put away their foreign gods, and the Lord continues to keep Jacob. And God appears to Jacob again, and he renames him a second time. Now, it's interesting because Hebrew is one of those funny languages where you can read things multiple ways. The grammar is very flexible. So it's possible that the first time, whenever he renames him, that the inflection is sort of like, okay, you have contended with the Lord and you have won. You won. You beat him. But the second time that it's more along the lines of, hey, you've wrestled with God, but he has contended over you. Instead, now you're the one who is broken. And I think that that's especially possible because the next thing that happens in the story is that Rachel dies in childbirth. And from here on out, we're going to see that Jacob, his spirit seems to be completely broken. He doesn't have that same fire, that same chutzpah, that same willingness to even step out. And I find that as a kind of a warning to say, hey, God wants to use our fire, but like, hey, he invites us to wrestle with him, but also we need to let him, we need to submit to him. We need to be able to say, you know what, Lord, you are the one who is sovereignly in control, not to insist on our own way. The other thing that's interesting here is in chapter 48 of Genesis, Jacob will reference the death of Rachel, and he will say, it was to my sorrow that Rachel died, and the text, again, Hebrew, can also read it was to my fault, or because of me, Rachel died. And if you remember that oath that Jacob made, hey, the one with whom those foreign gods are found shall die. And I don't know if the Lord took him at his word, or if Jacob at least believed that it was because of him that Rachel died, but I think that that's definitely a possibility. And again, we see just the sorrow of this entire familial situation is just full of heartbreak and brokenness, left, right, center, the whole shebang. And here at the end of chapter 35, Isaac dies. We do have, it seems like, a reuniting. I wanted to say reunition, and I was like, I don't think that's a word. Somebody fact check me on that, tell me later. And both of his sons bury him. Again, I find that to be striking that both of his sons are burying him together, perhaps a hint of something of restoration. As we close out on the story of Jacob, he's not completely out of the picture. We're going to see him in Joseph's story as well. Chapter 36 is actually all about Esau, which again, I find really interesting that these characters, which normally I would just sort of throw out, and I'm like, oh yeah, Esau, he was there. But there's an entire chapter that is dedicated to Esau's legacy, that the Lord blessed him, that the Lord made him prosperous, that they were rulers in the land. And I find it striking, again, the redemptive nature of Esau's story. And yet, y'all, Esau isn't the one through whom the promise comes. Ultimately, I kind of like Esau better. Now, having studied, I'm like, he seems like a nicer person. Like, I kind of want to be friends with Esau. He was, kind of trying to do the right thing, and he had all this forgiveness in his heart, and Jacob is kind of, he's not my fate. And yet, it is through Jacob that the story and the line is reckoned. And there seems to be something about God is excited about the person who wants in, even whenever we mess up. And that's just so encouraging. And so, are we willing to step out in faith? To be willing to make some mistakes? Because that's the kind of faith that the Lord is looking for. Food for thought as we bring Jacob to a close. Just wanted to throw it up on the board here. All of Jacob's kids. Oh, I didn't put Benjamin on because, well, I forgot about him. Yep. So, because he's so forgettable. He's so forgettable. So next week we are going to do Joseph part 1. We are breaking Joseph up into 2 parts. You are welcome. And so there's only 4 days for that. Small group discussion on the board. You can break into small groups, and then I'll switch back to that side. Thanks, everybody, for your time and attention. Have a fabulous evening.